Jordan Zlatev is our next speaker. So Jordan is a professor of general linguistics and head of the cognitive semiotics division at Lund University. And in fact, he's one of the founders of cognitive semiotics, both research-wise, but also institutionally. For example, he was one of the founding fathers of International Association for Cognitive Semiotics. There's a lot to Jordan's work, but here I would like to draw your attention to his work on mimesis, which he uses as a platform for discussing the evolution of human communication and cognition, and specifically the development of uniquely human form of communication based on signs. We see it in his proposal of mimesis hierarchy and polysemiotic communication, and his work on pantomime belongs to this context. His work is both experimental and theoretical. It's a double pleasure to introduce Jordan because he has been a long-term collaborator, friend, and in fact a member of the Center of Language Evolution Studies in Toruń. This talk has two co-authors, but Marta Sibierska will be properly introduced tomorrow, and perhaps a few words will also be said about the least important co-author. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Przemek. It's a pleasure and an honor. Apart from my other visits to Toruń, I just had a déjà vu of Evulang a few years ago. Evulang, the big one. The big one. I think it was 2018, right? Yeah. Yeah. And actually, there was a talk where both the Polish group and the Italian group were co-authors, if you remember. I think it was called From Pan to Lang, from pantomime to language. And the key point was narrative, was a puzzle there to help explain this transition from pantomime to language. So I have to admit that I haven't read Francesco's more recent paper, the one that Micah was referring to several times. I'm looking forward to hearing about it. It seems that, again, that we are agreeing on many things, which is maybe not so surprising. Hope that things will emerge from this workshop, apart from not just interesting discussions and ideas and a volume, but maybe even more collaborations. So, yes, this is a joint talk again with Marta and Przemek. The outlines is, I have to tell you a bit about cognitive semiotics. As we were discussing yesterday, if one doesn't have to introduce what linguistics is or what psychology is, but cognitive semiotics is, alas, less known and not that ancient. So it needs some definitions and explanations. So the idea that we developed in that 2020 paper that some of you may have seen in the folder in the Journal of Language Evolution, Pantomime is the original human system. It's kind of the theoretical background that I will sum up a bit, but also the link to narrative that was implicit there. I will try to make it even more explicit. And not to any kind of narrative, but to primary. I'll introduce a notion of primary and secondary narrativity based on our work in cognitive semiotics. This is the plan for roughly the first 20 minutes. And then we'll go into the ongoing empirical study that I do with Marta and Przemek and Johan and our coders as well. And so what we're seeing there is, what I would like to describe here is a transition from simple to complex narratives. I'll be using the terms simple and complex rather than proto. And actually, I seem to be agreeing with Francesco that these are not proto-narratives expressed in pantomime. It's fully fledged narratives, just they are of the simple kind. Again, maybe just a terminological issue that we'll discuss a lot. And briefly discussions and conclusions at the end. So, yes, this International Association for Cognitive Semiotics that was formed 2014. If you go on its home site that is hosted in Denmark, where cognitive semiotics is strongly represented, you can learn a bit about it and its past and coming conferences, the one next summer in Aachen. The goal is to integrate perspectives, methods, insights from cognitive science, cognitive linguistics, and semiotics, placing signs and sign use. The term sign, please, especially after we had a wonderful talk about sign language linguistics, remember that signs here is a broader notion, as actually one of the key notions of semiotics and cognitive semiotics. So when I'm defining sign in a moment, it's not sign language science, it's a theoretical concept of sign. So this is a graph that we've used a lot. So we are integrating large aspects of these disciplines from linguistics, cognitive science, and semiotics. And voila, we have a new discipline called cognitive semiotics with its own PhD program in Lund and in 3-4 other places, master's program, or etc. So we started, collaborating with people like Peter Jadenfors in cognitive science and some time ago, 15, 20 years ago, and over this time, a new discipline was born. So it's not just a field of interdisciplinary cooperation. Cognitive semiotics is a new discipline on the same level as these more established ones. A concept that we like to use to characterize it methodologically is the conceptual empirical loop. You may say that we're most preoccupied of defining notions such as narrative, pantomime, sign, signal, etc. But unlike philosophers, we go on the empirical side and see how they're manifested in use and development. And then, perhaps a little bit more than only empirical scientists, we want to take the loop back to the conceptual side and see what these empirical investigations have helped us understand. So I'll be doing several iterations of this, including notions such as pantomime and complex and simple narratives today. Methodologically, we triangulate, not just in the everyday sense of triangulating qualitative and quantitative, or just two methods of any kind, but phenomenological methodological triangulation. And phenomenology, from Husserl to Dan Zahavi or Sokolovsky, etc., is the discipline that has influenced at least the way we do cognitive semiotics in Lund enormously. That means putting the subject first, the first-person perspective, in conceptual analysis, in judgments, is what we postulate is the necessary first step in any investigation, including in narrative and pantomime. Very quickly after that, engage with people in flesh and blood, not with data, but through participant observations, interviews, etc., understand empathetically how people use, in our cases, narrative, pantomime. Not just the concepts, terms, but how they actually use them. And that brings us naturally to the third most detached perspective, in which we have operationalized notions and can start quantifying them. Right? So you see a very natural loop, but we'd like spelling it out to see what makes cognitive semiotics different from maybe cognitive science or linguistics. Husserl, as I mentioned, is one of our heroes. In Ideas 1, he formulated what he called the principle of principles, that every originarily given intuition is a rightful source of knowledge. Everything that presents itself is to be taken as that which it gives itself to be. More simply put, trust the subject. Start from the first-person perspective. And even use that as a constraint on what is evidence. As Ide spells this out, what is given or accepted as evidence must be actually experienceable within the limits and related to the human experiencer. Right? So pantomime, narrative, yes, but as something that is experienced, not something that is postulated to be in the cognitive unconscious, the functional mind, or somewhere else where it's beyond, does not fulfill this constraint. Again, you may think this is controversial, or vice versa, that it's so obvious that it doesn't need to be spelled out. But it does rule out a lot of theoretical abstractions that are, by definition, not experienceable. How about narrative? A term that is used perhaps too much. Many people have pointed out that since the narrative turn, some 20 years ago, in psychology, in linguistics, in social sciences, it went beyond narratology, which is a field that is established from the 50s, 60s, combining from various points. Nowadays, you find the term narrative everywhere, and because of that, it becomes increasingly ambiguous. So classic narratologists as Genet have pointed that out 40 years ago, Ryan, and our work as well. So here is a definition of narrative that one often bumps into. the one by Prince, as a logically consistent representation of at least two asynchronous events that do not presuppose or imply each other. Asynchronous here in the sense of not at the same time. Okay? So it's not bad, but two events, is that really a narrative? Even a proto-narrative? Maybe it's too minimal. And also it uses the R word, representation. That causes a lot of mischief. What do we mean by representation? So, following Aristotle's classical work, we can understand this representation, or the story, as consisting of at least three parts, beginning, middle, and end. And notice we're already beyond the two events of Prince. And furthermore, I think it follows the principle of intuition and experienceability, that there has to be a narration. No narration, no narrative, because narration is what is experienceable. And it needs to be done in one or another system. Here is a definition that comes close to what we're working with theoretically. It was used by Ball some 20 years ago, and we just segment his passage. So first of all, there has to be a narrative text in which an agent or subject conveys to an addressee, tells in scare quotes, because it doesn't have to be language, a story in a particular medium. And this medium can be language, imagery, sounds, buildings. I thought about Michael's recent work. So building can be, according to Ball, the narration of part, or the text can be in building form, or some polysemiotic combination of these, as we would say. The story is the content of that text that produces a particular manifestation, inflection, and coloring of a fabula. And a fabula is a series of logically and chronologically related events that are caused or expressed by actors. Right? So using both old traditional orthological terms. So the fabula is chronological. The story can twist this chronology and put it in any order you wish. And the narration is going to manifest it. Yeah. We can spell this out as a three-level model, that a narrative is the overall structure, and the different levels are the levels of narration, of story, and fabula. And using some understandings between story and fabula, we can say that the fabula, again, is the causally and chronologically ordered sequence of events. The story is what presents it in a particular frame, with beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily in this order. And then the actual telling of the story in language, in pictures, in pantomime. In the future, to simplify things a bit, we'll be compressing story and fabula and just calling it story when we go to our two different conditions in the experiment. But let's for a few more slides keep these three levels, because they help us make a very important theoretical and methodological distinctions that I think clarified a lot of things for us. And I hope they help some else, namely the difference between primary and secondary narrativity. Primary narrativity is when you are really told a new story. Right? The narration is explicit enough, structured enough to be able to be told something new. I think some of our discussions in the morning were leading exactly to this, to be able to tell a new story rather than just activate an already existing story. This is rather secondary narrativity. If you already know the story, right, and all you need is a trigger, then we're having secondary narrativity. Right? And notice this is so let's give some examples. This distinction is actually taken from a paper in Public Journal of Semiotics by Georgios Stampoulidis, in which he had a corpus of street art in the streets of Athens. So in pictures like these, you can say that, okay, do they tell a story? Well, and the question is, what do you mean tell a story? If you mean primary narrativity, the answer is no. There's not enough sequence, there's not enough structure. If you give them to people, people will come up with various interpretations, maybe even narrative interpretations, but this will be idiosyncratic or depending on how you ask them. But again, that's the point, that this single pictures, we can generalize, participate only in secondary, not in primary narrativity. We wrote some examples. So what Stampoulidis writes is we can compare pictures like these with pictures from Greek newspapers around the Second World War type, in which Greece was personified as a warrior, either ancient or more modern, and then in that time the enemy were the Nazis. According to Stampoulidis, here the enemy is the Troika, or the EU. Disconcerting analogy between the Nazis and the EU, at least according to this interpretation, led by the meta story or frame setting of Greece versus a powerful enemy. And again, if you know these stories, then you can interpret these as a narration. But if you don't know, then you can interpret it in many different ways. Again, secondary, not primary narrativity. And a final example of secondary narrativity are statues. Does the statue tell you a story? Well, not in the primary narrativity sense. And we actually did a study with Wenjing Li, with Chinese participants and Western participants. And depending on their background of Hans Christian Andersen, they had very different interpretations of this statue. So intersemiotic translation from fairy tale to sculpture is this in-press paper that we hope will appear any moment in Science System Studies. So that's secondary narrativity, to put it kind of aside, because we're going to be interested in primary narrativity. I'm sorry, one last example, music. Music is also a narration that can partake of secondary but not primary narrativity, we would claim. So look at the famous Peter and the Wolf. If there was no narrator to actually tell the story of Peter, the grandfather, the wolf, the duck, etc., if you only play the music, people will not be able to understand the story. We have done experiments with it. People can recognize the various themes. What is the wolf and what is the bird? Especially if you do it in a Bubba Kiki type of a contrastive situation. But they will not be able to reconstruct the story without language. Okay, primary narrativity, again, is our interest. And to get soon to pantomime. Language is often said to be the paradigm of narrative, or at least of primary narrativity, we say. Language is the only semiotic system, writes Ryan, in which it is possible to formulate propositions. Well, perhaps, but does this make language the only semiotic system capable of primary narrativity? I mean, the issue of propositions in language is debatable, but there's much more to narrative than propositions, right? So what about sequences of pictures? It's quite clear that once you know how to read a sequence of picture, the conventional order, left to right, top to down, or another order, let's say in Japanese manga, you can understand a narrative, a new narrative, in a 100-year-old political story or in Charlie Brown, right? Even if you haven't seen these before, if you work them through and ask people to intersemiotically translate from the images to language, you get quite a lot of coherence of what people are interpreting. Ergo, primary narrativity is not limited to language. And of course it's not. We can go to silent film and to video games that have no language whatsoever. And Marta was just telling me in some preliminary study, you can take the Charlie Chaplin films and take away all the what are they formally called?
I'm not sure, the captions. In certain movies you get those captions that sort of summarize the situation.
Right, and now somebody comes in. They don't help so much. You can get pretty much the story, the primary narrativity, and notice we're getting closer to our interest, pantomime. And the question, is it primary or secondary? And we'll be arguing, as already implied, that it has the potential for primary narrativity, hence full narratives, not proto-narratives. Ryan, again, is skeptical, saying that chronological rearrangements would be impossible in a pantomime because gestural narration unfolds entirely in the present. Hence, the only kind of narrative that would be capable in the case of pantomime would be chronological, what we're going to be calling iconic narrations. Perhaps, but this is still a fully fledged narrative. So time and chronology is important, right, for narrative. Everybody recognizes that. How often a given event is narrated can vary. Right? You can repeat it many times, at the beginning, at the end. The duration can be compressed. So even if you follow the same chronology, it doesn't have to be on a one-to-one basis. 100 years can be 5 minutes. But perhaps more relevant for us in our empirical study is the order in which events are presented. So complex narratives, we know, very often are not chronological. They start in media res, and then we get flashbacks to understand how the person happened. Any film on Netflix now, you'll start with, and then you'll go and understand the background. And then, now, let's simplify, as I said. The 3 levels become 2. So we have the beginning, middle, end on story, and we have narration is the experienceable, expressed part of the narrative. So you can have either an iconic narration, iconic in the semiotic Peircean sense. Similarity doesn't have to be visual. Similarity can be also very diagrammatic. So this is an example of an iconic narration. This is an example of a counter-iconic narration of the kind that we just mentioned, in which we start with the middle and then go back to the beginning and the end. The end tends to be at the end, but not always, including in our manipulation, which actually we can discuss rather what's one of the reasons that our participants are having problems with it. So our general hypotheses were that pantomime has the potential for primary narrativity, hence it can express narratives, not just proto-narratives, but what we would call simple narratives, iconic. That's the condition of iconic narration. And it can, to be able to express complex narratives, for example, with this counter-iconic condition, it will need to be enhanced with proto-grammatical structure. And I think this is what we were touching on this morning in the direction towards proto-language. So the notion of pantomime, I guess we'll discuss it more this evening. So very briefly here, this is the system this is the paper that we've been mentioning several times. What did Michael call it? The classical definition, or the iconic definition, or official. So I don't have to reread it again. Mimetic, visual, whole body. I think what we agreed working at it, this is kind of the prototypical form, but we don't want to make this definition excluding. What if say it's not the whole body as we discussed? What if I'm sitting? Is it automatically not pantomime? Why so? If it's to some degree conventionalized or micro-conventionalized, does it stop being? No, if there's a gradual transition, as in the sign language that Anna was telling you about, there should not be a cut-off point. Rather, there should be more or less pantomimic. Also, something that maybe not all of us agree all the time, I tend to view gesture as the core of pantomime. I would not like to put them again as completely distinct from each other. And also, the rudiments of depiction. I think Michael was mentioning the possibility of making traces. Movements can leave traces. There are wonderful work on sand stories. Aborigines in Australia, many people were, as they're pantomiming and narrating, they draw also on the sand. So polysemiotic, so pantomime, even if it doesn't involve language per definition, it's not fully conventionalized, it doesn't involve complex drawings like this, is a polysemiotic system with gesture at the core in our definition here. It has the first potential the first human system based on signs. Signs, as we define them, are distinct from signals, which are mostly innate. They're under low conscious control. The signals tied to particular contexts, mostly dyadic, and it's hard to lie with signals. You can deceive in a functional sense, but you cannot lie. You cannot make the choice to, and why? Because signs, in our definition from 2020, let's see how long this definition survives. It's been there for 1 year. It implies awareness of the conscious subject of the expression-object relation. If not every time, at least potential awareness. That is not a direct causal link from, as in most kind of signals. So it's the B condition that actually gives signs this freedom to lie with. And we'll say that this is what pantomime does, a system of signs. I have been talking for about 20 minutes or so, right? So am I? Yeah. I'm on schedule then. I'll come to the empirical study if you're not worried. That my talks tend to be front-heavy, as much of work in cognitive semiotics, but we'll get there. So another model that has been, as Przemyslaw mentioned, very influential for us, that's been Merlin Donald's theory of stages of human cognition. So we have mimetic stage, Homo erectus, or a bit before that, revolution in skill, in gesture, including vocal gestures for him, nonverbal communication, share attention, etc. Now, Donald doesn't speak about simple narratives, but our point will be that this here is, we have the capacity to do simple narratives. He's interested in myths. That's why he calls this stage the mythic stage, linked to fully fledged language. But we want to understand the transition, right? From simple to complex. And with the help of experimental semiotics and perhaps other methods, including emerging sign languages, etc., we can help perhaps understand that. Okay, so experimental semiotics to the rescue, and this notion of intersemiotic translation. If you're not familiar with the term, Roman Jakobson introduced it some 60 years ago. So normal translation that we think is from language to language. Intersemiotic is going from one semiotic system to another semiotic system. So from language to film, for example, or from film to language, what is nowadays often called intermediality or so. So see, our participants are de facto performing intersemiotic translation, as you'll see in a moment. So we started with these typical kind of referential communication task designs, but I think we made the task more complicated than what is usually done. It's not single concepts that have to be communicated without language. It's whole stories. So even if these stories are still very minimal, consisting of 3 events that can be seen as a beginning, a middle, and end, albeit not always in that order. So the director must translate a 3-event story from text to pantomime. I'll show you an example. Of course, we don't give that as an extraction. We say reenact, etc. But this is what they're doing. Now the matcher, and we worked about how to operationalize comprehension. In a future study, actually, we would like to ask the matchers just to do intersemiotic translation back again from pantomime to language. And I think we'll see both agreement and disagreement. Here we made it easier for them. We just gave them, you'll see in a moment, 4 different options to choose from, to say which one is the correct, as often is in experimental semiotics. So there were 4 games per each diet, each game 12 rounds. Each participant is the director 6 times and matcher 6 times, and then they switch roles. So there's a lot of conventionalization going, as we hoped. So here are the 2 major conditions. As I say, the simple narrative, iconic narration, if you remember the diagram, from one-to-one mapping between story and narration. We have causal event 1, causal event 2, and result. In the key condition, we made it hard. So we manipulated this, so we started always with the result first. For example, a man was sad because when he reached for an apple on a tree, he found out that it was bad. I mean, even in language, it's much more complex. Notice all the grammatical words. Notice the because, etc. On the other hand, a man reached for an apple, the apple was bad. The complexity is there in the syntax. Now, so again, to make this very simple for those. So step 1, on a monitor, the director was presented with the story, in this case, in the iconic narration condition, asked to read it and understand it, then go to an area and reenact it in pantomime. Instruction was to rely only on whole body movements, no words, no time limit. Vocalization was not encouraged, but it occurs from time to time nevertheless, spontaneously. We can discuss about the multimodality of pantomime or so. So here's an example. In the simple narrative condition, let's hope the video works. And this is what the narrator, the director just saw on the monitor, understood it, and this is her performance. Pretty clear, right? If you didn't have the text, you could see how you would understand it. But you have now, you see the sequencing and the facial expressions, and again, even the sadness at the end reenacted.
I thought it was a woman.
Really? Okay, yes. She doesn't mark at all the gender. She just is that, I guess. But especially later on, they do conventionalize fairly boring signs of gender. So here is a man was sad in the counter-narrative condition, because when he reached for an apple in a tree, he found out that it was bad. Much harder to understand, also harder to perform. We can look at it again. He does the disappointment at the beginning, but he also does it at the end of it. And is this a gender marker?
Yes, so in this was a man, and sorry, this was a woman.
Okay. Yes. So again, this could have been I mean, they were conventionalizing within the diets. So, and then the matcher is asked to match what they saw with one of 4 comic strips, namely like this. And here then, they're not in random order. We just put them together for your understanding. As you can see, here we have the story about the man reaching in for an apple, and the apple being bad and sad. And only one condition was correct. So to get the happy face at the bottom, and they received it, both director and matcher on each trial, they had to get both the story right and they had to have the narration right. Right? So the last 2 you saw, if it was the first case, only this would have counted as correct. In the second, only this would have counted as correct. And this is another story in the 2 different narrations. So the specific hypotheses were that simple narratives in the iconic narration would be communicated successfully almost always. Right? So complex narratives in the counter-iconic narration, again, you can say that this is our operationalization of simple and complex. There are many other features that we can discuss and haven't mentioned that characterize simple and complex narratives, but at least this aspect, the asynchronicity, is going to be much harder and much less successful. But we hope this is why we had 4 games, that they would conventionalize markers, not just of gender, etc., but also of the order, to make it clear, to get it right, whether it's a iconic narration or a counter-iconic narration condition. And happy days. The preliminary results, as Marta has been telling me 10 times to emphasize, because all the data is not yet analyzed, is it is overwhelmingly much easier to communicate the iconic chronological than the other one. Right? So now if we break them up in different games, let's say start with the bottom. You see improvement, strong improvement, almost exponential, from 10% to 55%. So they are learning. So how are they learning? Well, they must be establishing some strategies to make it clear that they're using this complex condition. It's pretty much stable, but a little bit, if it's too little difference to make a big thing about it, but it seems to be some negotiation in the second game condition. When we have all the data together, if this turns out to be significant, and then rising up again, which does make sense because there is an interference, even confusion between the complex and the simple condition. How would they communicate without language what they're doing? So this is our answer with the help of our work. We looked at the data, Marta mostly, then we looked together, and then we had our coders look at the data. We established this set of strategies of markers. Enacting asynchrony. I'll show you examples and videos of all of these in a moment, showing the complex order in a complex way, that is starting with the end, like the man did, like when he did the second story. Doing a metaphorical gesture. We were expecting a lot of these metaphorical before, right, to mark that. We got only 1 or 2, very few of these. We'll see examples. Enumeration, somehow 1, 2, 3. This we get a lot, but we also get in trouble because we're not only sure what 1, 2, 3 mean. Attention can sometimes look like number 1, but more often was interpreted as, watch out, something is complex here, don't get fooled, this is dangerous. Ambiguous is between 2 and 3. Timeline, I'll show you a beautiful example. The participant is gesturing the cartoon, the comic strip, 1, 2, 3, and pointing out exactly afterwards what is going to happen. And then other, I don't know if we had any other so far. We left one open for. So the strategy types established inductively by the researchers and operationally defined. We had 2 coders, independent from the researchers who did it and independent from each other. Inter-rater agreement is going to be calculated in the next few weeks, and then negotiation until consensus after that. So here is the first and most common strategy of communicating the complex narratives, the asynchronous. But also, as you'll see soon, it was used also sometimes in the simple narrative condition. So here is the woman has to pantomime a man was hanging from the roof because when he was climbing a ladder, the wind blew it away. Which event was missing?
The wind.
No wind, right? But on the other hand, the hanging was there both at the beginning and at the end. Not uncommon at all to see this kind of repetition effect. So notice, even if they put the end at the beginning, the end came back in its proper place at the end. So here is the one with both enacting a chronology, what we're calling it here, if it's the right term, and then a metaphorical before. A very beautiful and clear example. The same. Notice that she both did before and actually moved in space. So kind of, the time and space metaphor kind of in both ways expressed. Again, this time it's a woman. But again, the man is not gestured at all, so we wouldn't know who it is. Again, for common work, I think we have to do the same thing, but without having them pick just the comic strip, but actually re-narrate back into language and see how much agreement and disagreement there's going to be. Okay, attention. Here is the attention. Man. Several attention markers, and here comes the most beautiful. Butterflies slide. Again, I wonder whether people recognize this as a butterfly and be able to connect it. So, and then the last example here. Notice that the condition was complex. That is, a woman braked her car because, but the way the person is going to narrate it is going to be chronological. But he will have a marker at the beginning to indicate either I'm going to start with a second, or on a meta level, we're doing strategy too. We're doing the more complex one. So. Some grunting, right? So normalizing the order back to chronological. Okay, this is the last one with the timeline, the marking of the frames in the cartoon. And notice, since they have changed roles, they know what the other has to do. So this is maybe third or fourth game, right? That they're doing it. A simple narrative condition. 1 point. Woman. kind of redundant, you can say, very expensive. And you wonder, why did he have to do it so much for the simple condition if it was not for, there was also the difficulty of confusing it with the complex one. And they had gotten that wrong several times. So I'm coming towards the end. Frequency in strategies increased. Again, with every game, we had to see more and more cases in which there was 1 or 2 or even 3 different strategies per game. But interestingly, duration decreases. So even if it took them more time to do this overall, the time they were playing each game, so there must be a learning game effect happening. And the preliminary results is supporting of our third hypothesis, if you may remember, that the complex narrative condition, the achronological, the counter-iconic, etc., is going to give rise to more markers of any of the kinds. But interestingly, against our initial hypothesis, there was a substantial number also in the simple narrative condition, right? Just like the one that you saw. Here's an example of in a counter-iconic narration in the simple narrative condition. So why is this the case? The scary bear came at the end, even though in the story it was the second place. Why? Perhaps because it was more economical. Otherwise, he could play both events on the single position as the man and then the bear on the other side. So here is an example that Marta prepared that I think very nicely shows how over time in the 2 different colors, you have the 2 players in the game. So it's the yellow one who is trying more often, and star here indicates success, not ungrammaticality as in linguistics. So you see a very successful pair in the second, managing to conventionalize their expressions and get all of them right at the end. Here, one that tries, maybe by luck the first time it works. Here, but again, and at the end, but largely they are not able. So there's a lot of variation. Again, we can do microanalysis and see why was the conventionalization much more successful in the second case rather than the first. So to sum up, it is much easier to enact stories in a chronological order in pantomime, but sometimes participants may disrupt chronology spontaneously, like in that last case. So disrupting for communicative effect, etc., may be one of the many bits and pieces that gives rise to complex narrativity, and then it's later conventionalized and maybe even more so. Successful negotiation between participants possible, but far from trivial. Right? So at the beginning, you may have thought it's a no-brainer. Of course, it'll be much more easier to do the chronological iconic than the other. But again, the surprising things of doing the actual empirical study is that you get these achronologies even in the simple condition. And also, some participants reported that they realized it, but they didn't know how to express causality. Nobody tried to grammaticalize a because. Maybe not surprisingly. Again, something where language excels, but even this kind of pantomime plus that we're having, that is pantomime with markers, still has its limits. And they said that it was challenging, it was confusing in the interviews afterwards. And even when they managed to develop and they often still failed to choose the correct picture. And one reason is, remember, they had to, if this was a complex narrative condition, for a woman is blowing in a balloon, a man comes and pierces it, and then it explodes. The fact that in the pictorial end effect, it starts with the end without any marker, because, etc., feels like it's counterintuitive, because this is not the way cartoons are. So I think in some way we may have made the task very easy for people, just choose the right one, but in some ways actually quite hard. So pantomime is an efficient semiotic system for the communication of simple narratives. It's our conclusion. Whether you agree with our conclusion, we'll see. With iconic chronological narration order, it is much more difficult to communicate complex narratives with this counter-iconic non-chronological narration order. And the chances for succeeding in the latter increase when specific strategies to marking become conventionalized. And we would like to see this as a micro-operationalization of the transition from pantomime to proto-language. Right? Again, many other factors are there that make this difference, but I think this is one factor that distinguishes them. And let us finally share here an ongoing paper, since this is a workshop in which we're sharing unpublished work, in which with Przemyslaw and Aaron Stutz, an anthropologist, we're applying the mimesis hierarchy to the evolution of human collaboration, basing it on existing paleoanthropological evidence, and seeing 4 stages of the evolution of cooperation, starting with alloparenting and perhaps sex-based division of labor, to obligate cooperative foraging and hunting, around the time of simple narratives. It's the Donald's mimetic stage. Then proto-language from 800 to 200,000 years ago, still polysemiotic, but now gestures with an increasing role for speech, and having phenomena such as norms and sections and Deacon's sex contract being placed here rather than 3 million years ago as he did in 97. And something that we would all agree is language is something much more recent, dominated by speech, but still continuing to have a strong role of gesture, and with an increasingly stronger role for myths and depiction. And again, notice that here we have the transition from simple to complex narratives, to being an important puzzle piece in this evolutionary scenario. So thank you, Johan and Monica as co-researchers. Thank you, Adam and Mariusz as coders, assistants, and thank you for your attention and questions.
Thanks to you, Jordan, and your 2 co-conspirators. That's a very nice step. I just wanted to make 2 comments that came to mind amongst the many that this stimulates. One is, of course, in your first pantomime, the man was a woman and the apple could have been a plum. And so one can think of that not as a deficiency, but in terms of the sort of challenge of how we start from pantomime in immediate context. There's only one fruit tree nearby. If I say pick a thing, then you don't have to worry about whether it's an apple or a plum, and you can point to which tree you want. The second one I think was more interesting observation was the showing this interruption or leaving till the end the bear or the butterfly. And I was reminded of a development in ASL, and I assume other sign languages, of signing space. So you can perform signing, and then you place the bear here, if you like, and then you can do more signing and place the man in a different place, and then you can do the action starting from the man and the bear and back again. Because you already know, oh, what's happening over there is the bear, what's happening over there is the man. And that seems a very natural, emergent from the sort of problems you were identifying with your naive pantomime. So I think that is just a post note for your next paper.
Thank you very much. Starting with the last point, Michael, I think this is an advantage of not starting with pictures. In previous studies, we had used pictures or a matrix as what the director gets, and then some of these effects we could have see them due to the iconicity between the picture and the pantomime. But here we start with language that doesn't have that space. So indeed, this is use of pantomime space, an extension of gesture space, etc., to play that. And yes, and again, about objects, I think you made that point very clear in your talk. Remember, this is what I asked you to clarify what pantomime, one of the deficiencies is individuating, again, apple versus plum, etc. Actions, good, even sequences of actions. So the reason I said that we're still calling them narratives is not because they're up to Proust level, or even to the level of asynchronous, chronological, but still they have a sequence of events and they can tell something new. They're not. That's why I gave those examples of secondary narrativity, a single picture, a musical piece, a statue. Right? They're much more than that. Right? We agree on that. So it's not. It's primary narrativity, whether we want to call it proto or simple. It still is on the way towards
the more fully fledged narratives that proto-language is going to help developing in language even more. But again, not only language, also language in polysemiotic contexts with pictures and with gestures and so on. Yeah.
Okay, I want to comment on, follow up on Michael's comment, actually. The situation that Michael noticed about a female actor enacting a male character, right?
Yeah.
So we did a similar study some time ago, and it was Przemyk's idea to look into this particular aspect, and I did the numbers, and I saw a significant difference and a large effect of what guesses of pantomimic films point to, depending on the gender of the actor. So if the actor in the movie, in the film, in the stimulus, is female, they tend to choose preferentially pictures, because the design was with pictures representing female characters, and vice versa. And also there is a similar effect, but a little bit different, that success rate, like the rate at which the participants guessed pantomimes also depended on the match of the gender of the actor and the character in the picture. All right, this is a little bit complicated, but what it boils down to is this limitation of pantomime that Michael mentioned, that you tend to naturally assume it takes some mental operation to dissociate the actor from what is being represented or who is being represented. So that's my comment.
I mean, thank you. I think it has to do with our baby here, the sign definition. That I'm trying to sell in a way that you need this. I mean, if you're pantomiming or gesturing gender explicitly, it's very clear that here we have an expression and an object or a content, right? Male, female. Normally, in the case when you're impersonating, the sign relationship is not clear. Am I just doing the action, or am I becoming part of the sign? So I think that's some of the reasons that we need this differentiation that my colleague Sonison has been emphasizing a lot between expression and content. The more something, the sign is like an object in the life world, the less it works as a sign, because people see it just as itself rather than standing for something else. And again, I think this is where pantomime as sign or as representation has to be distinguished from the simpler forms that is just demonstration. So at least in that paper we will say when pantomime is used, or I'm not sure I would call it pantomime, when it's used for demonstration, it's not yet a sign standing for something else. It is just the action itself. So yes, I think that's both the strength and the weakness of pantomime, the fact that it's so similar to practical actions. Yeah.
We do have some questions via Zoom. The first one is from Peter Jadenfors. In simple narratives, the events come in right causal order, but not in complex. Therefore, it is easier for onlookers to understand the story since it follows normal causation. Have you considered the role of causal cognition for degeneration and understanding of narratives?
Thank you, Peter. We have considered it, but not sufficiently. I mean, causality is one of the relations between events in a narrative, one of the core ones, but perhaps not the most simple. The simplest is simple temporal succession. So another way to differentiate narratives of different complexity is to distinguish sequences that are simply one after the other, even without causality. It's just that maybe causality versus other kinds of relations is one more dimension to experiment with. Thank you for the suggestion.
And another question from Francesco Ferretti. Thanks, Jordan, for the great talk. I found your experiment really convincing. Again, I agree the necessity to distinguish between different forms of narrative, primary versus secondary, or proto-narrative versus full narrative, is crucial. My question is about the result of accuracy growth you found in the complex order of narrative. In my opinion, this result can be interpreted in terms of actor abilities more than in terms of pantomime power of representation. What about it?
The accuracy growth in the condition of the complex.
In the two conditions.
In both. In both conditions. I mean, so the distinction you're making, Francesco, is between conventionalization that is happening that would help explain the growth, at least in the complex narrative in our interpretation, versus
the actor abilities is what Francesco mentions. Perhaps I will say a few words about the design. Yeah. We recruited naive participants, so this was convenience sampling, but our participants did not have any professional experience in motor communication, no acting training, or anything like that. So in this sense, they were all naive. But of course, they played 4 games and the whole session was quite lengthy. So there might be a learning effect, first of all. So people also seem to feel more and more comfortable as the session goes along. On the other hand, they also might become a bit tired. But as of now, we are not really able, I guess, to interpret those results in the full, because we have just concluded collecting data, and once we take a proper look at the whole data set, we might be able to say something more about it. Yeah,
I mean, thank you, Marta. And again, Marta is the one who would know the empirical study best of our group. So any questions about that would have to go to her. But again, I mean, notice that I think a strength in the design is, as you understood, that the same participants, irrespective of differences in acting abilities, performed both conditions. So when we average out the proportions, we still get this very strong difference between the simple and the complex. And again, a learning effect. This is averaged out over participants. I'm sure that when we look at them individually and have all the 30 diets, this will differ. But again, I mean, doesn't this interpretation confirm with what was the talks in the morning? That somehow, as far as simple narratives is concerned, you know, there's not much learning. It's almost stable. This is like pantomime in its niche of communicating 3 events in a sequence. It's the complex ones where we do see a learning effect. And this learning, at least for me, the best way to interpret it is a form of conventionalization. Yeah. Michael.
I wanted to ask about that. Just about the term conventionalization, because I was thinking about like Hans-Jörg Schmid's work, for example, where he kind of makes a distinction between conventionalization, which is something that's diffused in a community, and something like usualization, which is kind of an agreed upon way of doing things for, you know, a small group of people and maybe just 2 people. So, and the question, of course, is like if these are kind of different processes and if you can really call it conventionalization because that involves more people, and here it's just kind of like an interactional norm, basically, kind of an ad hoc way of agreement.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, what I agree with Schmidt mostly is separating the social dimension from the psychological, having entrenchment on the purely psychological side and making that distinction between the individual and the social that many people in cognitive linguistics forget. And of course, he knows much more about, you know, language change than I do, and taking notions such as usualization from, I don't know, where was it, Hermann Paul even who had those? But I know so yes, one can make these extra distinctions, but I would say they're not categorically distinct. A little bit like I like the continuum between pantomime and proto-signs in sign language. I would say also here we have a continuum between a group of 2, a group of 3. Let's play the Fey version of this game, and then let people, the pairs, cross pairs, and others. Then we'll start going from usualization to something that starts resembling like a micro-conventions in a group, right? Yeah. So I think we agree that yes, we need maybe to be more careful with both terms and notions. I think we've called them micro-conventions or something. Mm-hmm. The important thing is that if they don't agree, they can be as good actors as they wish and do 2 and 3, etc. But what does this 2 mean? Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Very, very interesting study. I have one comment whether you think this should be controlled for, or if you think this could affect maybe the success at guessing a complex narrative. It seems that the participants, they kind of entered a performative space. So there's kind of already some, if the performers were using space to indicate maybe temporality, so they're kind of entering the performative space and maybe they're going in that direction. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they were using that to their advantage because they were thrust into a performative space rather than maybe starting the performance in the middle of some space. Because I don't know to what extent the participants began at the beginning of the story here, at the beginning of the performative space, moved that way and then that way, because maybe we didn't see enough of the video samples. So I'm wondering if you think that could affect any of the success of guessing a complex narrative, just starting at the performative act in a different part.
Thank you very much, and I would pass it over to Marta, and maybe even to Mariusz and Adam, who've seen this 1,000 times.
Yeah, and they also have some experience because they piloted the study as well. Yeah, thank you, Dan, for the question. This is a good question, and I guess we haven't explained the particulars of the design of the study, but the rectangle that you could see outlined on the floor, it was for purely practical reasons. So we were video recording, and we asked our participants to try to do the pantomimes within this rectangle, but we were not like very particular about it. So we didn't really monitor this that much. It was just as a sort of a reference point so that the camera, which was mounted on a tripod, could catch them. So this was for purely practical reasons. But you're right, like this is not an entirely spontaneous setting in that respect. And perhaps something to think about for future studies is to make like this showing space, miming space, a bit more natural in that respect, because I guess it might have played a role, of course. And you could actually see that, I'm not sure if our examples captured it, but people did spontaneously start their pantomimes before entering this pre-designed miming space. So that would happen anywhere. And they just forgot the exact instructions, as is usually the case with such studies.
Thank you.
And thank you. One more question.
Sorry.
Okay, talk loud. Following up on that, which was articulated, I couldn't quite figure out how to say, but that's a good thing. I thought that we saw an example of that in the woman who was pantomiming the hanging from the ladder. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because she starts hanging from the ladder and then she steps to the side to crawl up the ladder. Mm-hmm. So she doesn't do this, but with her body she does that. And I didn't know if they counted as similar strategies.
She does make a step to the right a little bit, yeah.
So just a very quick follow-up comment. Actually, in another study that I will be presenting tomorrow, we are looking a little bit at that issue, like how people copy the physical orientation when they represent, especially visual stimulus. So I will be touching a little bit on that, but a very good point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for all the questions.
Thank you. So now there is the first Zoom talk ahead of us. So I don't know what we have to do here. Probably Francesco will have to share the screen. You will have to share the screen. So that's me. Okay. Yes, so we can see this screen. Yes. So I mean, my job is to introduce, but I only prepared the introduction for Francesco. So perhaps everything that I will say about Francesco applies also to Ale and Ines.